Hi, MBA students. Good evening. And tonight I want to share with you a little bit about risk management. So I've got a small little slideshow that I want to talk a little bit about risk and how risk is implicated in your project efforts. And so take a listen, take a watch. Hopefully you'll gather a thing or two, do the readings and from the text to support this video, and you should be well on your way to putting together a nice risk analysis for your project. So let's go ahead and get underway. So basically, as this slide shows, risk is universal. I mean, you see the land masses there on the slide itself. Risk is everywhere, and risk particularly is important to project managers in that we need to be able to know what our risk is on projects so we can proactively put together a plan and be able to manage risk so that it doesn't throw our project into a tailspin, and that we can get in front of these quote-unquote events that might happen on our project, and that those events won't hurt our project but allow us to be able to be on time and to be on budget and to be able to deliver a great project. So this is very interesting in terms of this opening slide. As you see the world, well, risk is very universal. So let's talk about that risk now as it's more related to projects. Well, as you can see here, we've got two definitions, one for project risk and one for uncertainty. And as you can see, the bullet point for risk, and I'll read the definition for you, is when the decision maker knows the probability and outcome of an event, then we can have an expected value of each alternative action to be determined to counteract that event. So with risk, it's actually something that we know has a probability of happening, and in its happening there's an outcome, and that outcome can be impactful to our project effort, to which then we can determine an action, or we can determine a plan that's proactive during the course of managing the project that will essentially mitigate or prevent that risk from happening. And so they counter the definition of risk here with uncertainty. So let's read what it says about uncertainty here. When a decision maker has incomplete information, of course we're talking about uncertainty, when this decision maker has incomplete information and cannot determine the expected value of each alternative. So it's almost like with uncertainty that it's unknown, and so we don't know for sure whether it's going to be a risk or not. With the risk, we understand the uncertainty and we understand what could likely be the outcome, and so as a result we can plan for it. With uncertainty, it's difficult to plan for it. So you almost have half of the equation, if you will, when we deal with risk and the events that lead to outcomes that are essentially outcomes that can be detrimental, as I said earlier, to your project. So it's good to understand what these two terms mean, risk and uncertainty. So here we speak further to that definition of risk. Bullet point 1, risk is an undesirable situation or circumstance. Risk has both a probability of occurring and a potential consequence to what it says here, program success, or essentially a potential consequence. So here's the key words here in this definition, is that it's undesirable, that it's not planned, it's not something that we want as part of our project, that it has a likelihood of occurring. It could be a very low likelihood, or the likelihood could be very high, but there is a consequence to the event. So if it does occur, there's a consequence, and that consequence will have some sort of impact to the project. And now you remember last night when we spoke about stakeholder management, that we know that with the stakeholder there's influence to the project and ultimate impact, but we don't know what that impact is until we know a little bit more about that stakeholder and how that stakeholder is woven and threaded into the project. So in this particular case, when we talk about risk, kind of the same idea. Risk will have an impact, and in the event of that risk occurring, and in the event of us knowing what that impact is, we're going to be able to put together some sort of risk mitigation plan to, one, either prevent that risk from happening, or two, to be able to mitigate it, mitigate it and lessen its impact on the project. So as you can see here, which is obvious, risks are associated with uncertainty. We're just not certain if a risk is going to happen, but we need to identify those risks and weigh them against the project. So here it speaks a little bit more further to what risk management is in terms of project management. You can see, as project managers, we are organized and systematic in how we evaluate risk on our project. And through risk management, we can efficiently identify the risk. We assess or analyze that risk, right? And risk analysis is what you're going to be delivering on Tuesday. So we need to know, what does that mean? What does that mean to analyze risk? And so upon analyzing risk, we hope to effectively reduce, as it says here, or eliminate completely risks that would impact our goal of the project. And so it's very important to list the risks, analyze those risks that we've listed, and be able to take a look at those risks that we've analyzed and find out between each one of those risks, what are their results in terms of their occurring and how they impact our project. Something that we really need to know is how those risks will impact our project. So here you see a nice workflow chart where it shows kind of the process of managing risk. And so I'm not going to dive down too closely into the details here, but I'm going to be topical in the sense that risk has a number of things that we want to carry forward in a linear fashion to ensure that we have a comprehensive insights to the potential risks to our project. And so as you can see here, we start out with putting together a risk plan, and that is just getting with the team and say, okay, guys, how are we going to go about and ascertain the risk issues on our project? We need to put together a risk plan. So upon putting together that risk plan and the process of how you will evaluate and determine that risk, we need to, one, identify risks. So, like you identify the stakeholders on a project, exhaustively identify all the risks that you see in your project. And it's a team collaborative effort. So if you've got a number of people working collectively on this project, you can generate a fairly extensive list. Once you have that list, then you need to analyze it, right? Risk analysis is how are you going about analyzing and determining the risks on your project. You've got and identified those risks. Now we're analyzing those risks. So what are you doing? And again, risk analysis, this is the core of what we want to share with our audience in how we're addressing risk on the project. And in this case, we're going to be analyzing risk. And as you can see, there's a number of things that we can look at when we analyze risk, right? And we look at both the qualitative piece and the quantitative piece, but really more so the qualitative piece, in that we want to identify, is the risk going to be a high impact, a medium impact, or low impact, right? Qualitative. And through that qualitative risk assessment, we can basically gauge the uncertainty or the certainty of that risk potentially happening. And from when that risk happens, we can ascertain the cost of what might be the implications if that event should occur, and as well as impact or delay to schedule, and potentially even to the quality or the performance of the scope of the work that we're seeking to perform. So that risk analysis piece, as you look at the flow chart, is very important to look at and to understand in the process of risk management. As you can see further, as we analyze the risk and identify further what that impact will be to the risk, is that we can then determine a definition, a risk definition, if you will, of how we want to mitigate that risk, right? So you can see here the question is asked, how can the risk be reduced? Even more so, I say, how can we proactively manage risk and put together a recipe in our project plan that allows us to be cognizant or recognize risk during the course of the project, so we're always in preventive mode of not allowing risk to happen. So we're not so reactive to risk, but we're proactive to risk to make sure that doesn't happen, or if it does happen, that we're prepared for it and we're able to really mitigate it and lessen its impact to our project. So you can see risk mitigation planning, I think, has some good information and some nice bullet points on how we address and mitigate the risk. And you can see here there's avoidance of the risk. We can control the cause or consequence of the risk, and that kind of leads to that proactive piece that I was telling you about. And lastly, we can either assume the risk, accept it, and if it happens, well, then we're screwed, or we can assume the risk if it's a low risk and be able to accept it and to just deal with it during the course of the project. So kind of no big deal. And then likely at the end, when we have kind of a plan set up, we want to think of the process of how we would institute it into our project effort, into the work of the project. So it's a matter of kind of weaving it into the work that we do on the project. So it's always kind of a constant, constantly being addressed in our efforts to manage the project. So questions to consider then when it comes to risk. And these are fairly simple statements, but does the risk statement describe a future event or situation? So what does that mean? Describe a certain event or situation. Well, you need to be clear about what you think that risk event is and be able to describe it clearly so you're able to assess it and to be able to understand its impact and to be able to have some sort of mitigation plan or response plan to be able to put against it. Is the source or cause of a risk based on factual evidence? Well, that's something that you and your team would need to have to determine. You can develop a risk management plan that is proactive. So during the course of the project, maybe you identify what we call risk triggers, or those points where we see potentially the upcoming risk event, because there are certain triggers that need to happen for that risk event to occur. So maybe there are reminders to show you during the course of the project as you're managing it in a proactive manner that you'll be able to identify those risk triggers and know that a risk might be coming. As you can see here, there's a few other bullet points that I'd like you to address and to read, and I think will be helpful in your assessment and analyzing the risk of your project. So here's a couple other tools that you can look at, and I like this tool that is the probability consequence matrix, where you can see that upon ways of addressing your risk and determining various levels of that risk when you address the probability or uncertainty of that risk occurring, you can see here that in this slide, the matrices or the spreadsheets that are shown kind of give you an idea of how you might want to approach the risk management situation. So you can see that there's a table here that's titled, "What are the chances that the risk event will occur?" Right? Next table, notice, given the event that it occurs, what is the magnitude of that impact? And so you can see that there's technical, schedule, and cost magnitudes that impact your project. And so through the course of defining and assessing the risk in your project, you can develop these types of tables that give you an idea of how to look at risk and how to assess it in the project that you're putting together. Now here's that up close item of that risk assessment technique, which is the probability, or what we call likelihood in this chart, and the consequence of that risk. And so each and every one of the risks that you identify can be placed in one of these boxes on this chart. And of course, if it's in the red, it'll be a critically high risk, as opposed to what's in green, which might be a low risk. And so high risk versus low risk, you're going to have mitigation, you're going to have response to those risks that'll differ based on the high risk and the low risk. So those are the things you need to identify. And in identifying those pieces and identifying how you assess and analyze and mitigate those risks will determine a value potentially that could be included into your project budget that will allow you to have, let's say, a contingency of money available in the event that that risk should occur. You can address it as you would have money set aside to be able to deal with that risk. We call that contingency plan, and in this case it would be a contingency budget. So here you have a quick event graph that I'd like you to look at. Just something you can see that as you look at risks, you understand that risk are high at the beginning but as you manage them, they become